I think the cleaning crew got lost again. The joke rolled across the boardroom of Whitmore Global Capital like a wave of cheap champagne, smooth, practiced, the laughter of people who had never once worried about rent or a hospital bill, or whether their names sounded acceptable enough to survive a hiring manager's first glance. Ava Brooks stood near the tall glass doors, one hand resting on the worn leather strap of her bag, the other still wrapped around the visitor badge security had clipped to her blazer downstairs. 72 floors below, rain drifted across Manhattan, turning the skyline to silver. Inside, the room smelled of cedarwood cologne, espresso, and old money. 12 executives sat around a walnut table the length of a small boat. Most were white men over 50 wearing watches that cost more than a teacher earned in 3 years. A few glanced at Ava with amused confusion. She looked too ordinary for the room, too calm, too black. At the head of the table, Charles Whitmore leaned back, silver cufflinks catching the light. 62, sharp blue eyes, the polished certainty of a man who believed every room belonged to him before he entered it. His gaze brushed over her for less than 2 seconds. "The catering entrance is downstairs," he said, sliding a contract toward another executive without looking up. More laughter. Someone muttered that HR was really struggling these days. Ava said nothing. She crossed the marble, her heels barely audible beneath the hum of the air conditioning, and stopped beside the single empty chair at the center of the table, the seat reserved for the incoming majority shareholder, a person nobody in the room seemed worried about. Whitmore Global had just survived the worst quarter in its history. The stock had bled 30% in 6 months. And still, the arrogance sat comfortably in Italian leather. An executive frowned. "Ma'am, this meeting is restricted." "I know." Her voice cut clean through the room without effort. Charles finally looked up, annoyed. "Then you know you're interrupting a $4 billion merger." Ava placed a thick black folder on the table. The sound landed harder than it should have. "Actually," she said quietly, "I own 51% of this company now." The rain seemed to get louder. One man laughed, then stopped when she didn't. Ava withdrew a stack of acquisition documents bound in gold clips. The transfer finalized at 4:17 Eastern. Blackstone Ridge sold controlling interest after this morning's emergency session. A younger executive snatched the pages, scanned them, and lost his color. "Charles." Whitmore took the documents from him. Every signature authentic. Every stamp legal. And a board member finally leaned forward and asked the question the whole room was thinking. "Who are you?" Ava looked around the walls her mother had once cleaned overnight. For half a second the boardroom dissolved and she was 8 again on the loading dock 3 floors down, doing homework on an overturned milk crate while her father fed coins into the 3rd vending machine. "Machine 3's got the good stuff," he'd whisper, glancing up at the ceiling out of habit. "Asterisk, and it's got a blind spot. No lens reaches back here, baby girl. This little corner belongs to us." Asterisk, she'd thought it was a game. She understood now it had been a map, drawn by a man who cleaned every camera's sight line in this building after midnight and knew exactly which ones lied. Then the memory was gone, and she met Charles Whitmore's eyes. "My name," she said, "is Ava Brooks." The silence that followed was total. But Ava was watching one face, and what she saw there did not match the others. The 11 men around the table wore shock. Charles Whitmore wore something else, something colder, more careful, more prepared. He did not look like a man ambushed by a stranger. He looked like a man who had been waiting 20 years for her to walk through that door. So the only question that mattered, the one that made the back of Ava's neck go cold, was simple. If her arrival was a surprise to everyone else in the room, why wasn't it a surprise to him? By morning, the story had a name, and the name was not Ava's. Asterisk hostile takeover. Asterisk it scrolled across the bottom of every financial channel before sunrise. The mysterious black woman who had seized control of one of America's most powerful investment firms during its weakest hour. Reporters massed under the awnings on Lexington, umbrellas knocking, camera lenses fogging in the cold drizzle. Inside, the lobby buzzed with whispers. Security murmured into earpieces. Employees clutched their coffee like it might be confiscated. Ava had not announced herself to the press. She had not announced herself to anyone. And yet the framing had arrived fully formed, overnight, as if someone had written the headline before she ever signed the deal. She rode the private elevator up to the executive floor and found the conference center already full, but the mood from the night before had curdled. No bourbon now. No relaxed laughter. The same men who had called her the cleaning crew now watched her with open hostility, because amusement had turned to fear, and fear in powerful men always looked like contempt. Richard Ellison rose before she sat down. He was the chief legal officer, lean, gray, 55, the kind of man who never raised his voice because he had never needed to. He opened a folder with the unhurried precision of someone who had read the ending of a book before buying it. Before this proceeds, he said, we need clarity on the unauthorized release of confidential materials tied to a decades-old investigation. And clarity, he added, on exactly how Ms. Brooks came to acquire her position. The acquisition is legal, Ava said. I didn't say it wasn't. Ellison smiled thinly. I said it raised questions. Ava held his gaze. He was good. Too good. He hadn't asked a single thing he didn't already know the answer to. And as the meeting churned around her, investors panicking, banks suspending lending reviews, executives demanding she explain herself, Ava kept returning to the same splinter of a thought. She had spent 4 years assembling the financing to buy this company. 4 years of quiet meetings, leveraged debt, a controlling stake she believed she had fought for. But Blackstone Ridge had sold faster than any seller in her experience ever sold. They had practically pushed the company into her hands at the exact moment it was burning. She'd told herself it was luck, desperation, a fire sale. But sitting in that room, watching Richard Ellison run a meeting he should have been losing, Ava felt the first thread of a colder possibility pull loose. Sellers that motivated didn't fire sale to a stranger. They fire sold to someone they wanted in the chair. So if the deal had been airtight, if everything she'd built was real, why did the whole thing already feel staged, like a play in which she'd just discovered, 3 lines into her opening monologue, that someone had written her part before she auditioned? The key still fit. Locker B, 14, sub-basement level, in a row of dented steel cabinets nobody had touched since the building installed key-card storage upstairs. Ava had carried the small silver key in her coat pocket for 2 days. Now she turned it, and the door groaned open into the smell of paper dust and industrial cleaner, the smell of her entire childhood. Inside, her father's things, a faded thermos, a spare pair of work gloves, and, beneath a folded maintenance jacket, a battered accordion file fat with photocopies, contracts, wire transfers, internal audits. Daniel Brooks had been a night maintenance supervisor with no authority to access any of it. But he had cleaned every office in the building after midnight, and rich men, Ava knew, become careless when they believe poor people are invisible. She had expected this. She had built 4 years of her life around the certainty that it would be here. What she had not expected was the date. She knelt under the buzzing fluorescent tube and spread the pages across the concrete floor, sorting by month, the way her father had taught her to sort laundry, darks, lights, the careful, and the urgent. The earliest documents ran from the spring her father was investigated. The latest should have stopped the week he was fired. But one memo didn't. It was an internal compliance note about the offshore restructuring, routine, dull, initialed in the corner. And it was dated 4 months after Daniel Brooks was already dead and buried in a cemetery in Queens. Ava sat back on her heels. Her father could not have copied a document that did not yet exist when he died, which meant someone else had opened this locker. Someone had used a man's forgotten grave as a filing cabinet, adding to a dead janitor's secret stash, hiding fresh evidence behind the one dead man no one would ever think to investigate. She looked at the rows of steel doors around her, every one of them locked, every one of them forgotten. And the question that rose in her was no longer asterisk, who destroyed my father? Asterisk, it was something worse, something that made her gather the pages with hands that had started, very slightly, to shake. Who in this building had known about a dead man's locker and had been quietly using it, in the dark, all the years she'd spent believing she was the only one who remembered it existed? She found Charles alone that night, in the boardroom where it had begun, standing at the glass with the city smeared silver behind him. You knew I was coming, Ava said. He didn't turn. I knew someone would. She placed the offshore memo on the table, the one dated after her father's death. Explain this. Charles looked at it for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its boardroom polish. When the Kingston investigation broke, he said, The board needed someone outside executive leadership to carry the blame. Legal pressure was building. Investors were threatening to pull out. I told myself protecting the company would protect everyone in it. His jaw tightened. I signed off on the cover-up. I let your father become the story. I have spent 20 years knowing exactly what that did to your family. 3 weeks after we let him go, he was dead, Charles said. Heart. The company physician signed the certificate himself. No one asked a single question, because no one ever does. He said it flatly, but something moved under the words that Ava filed away and did not yet understand. It was a confession, and it was fluent. Too fluent, she thought, the cadence of a story rehearsed alone for 20 years. He gave her the large crime freely, the concealment, the decision to let her father become the headline. He offered it almost gratefully, the way the guilty surrender the sin they can survive in order to bury the one they cannot. And Ava, who had spent her childhood reading Tired Men, noticed that every sentence of his confession pointed the blame upward, at himself, at the top, and somehow, always, away from the room next door. You ordered his termination, she said. And there, Charles went rigid. Go home, he said. Burn the files. Take the company and run it clean. His knuckles whitened against the table. Some of the men who built this thing are still in this building, and they are more dangerous than I ever was. The most dangerous one will smile at you while he does it. He looked at her then, and she could not tell, would not be able to tell for days, whether the thing in his face was a warning or a threat. She had come for a confession and gotten one, fluently, almost too easily. So why, walking out with everything she wanted in her hands, was she certain of two contradictory things at once? That the man who had just confessed had not actually committed the crime he confessed to, and that he might still, on the right bad night, be the one to destroy her? She let herself believe it that night. That was the mistake. She went home to Queens, to the apartment with the cracked linoleum, and she sat at the kitchen table and drafted the address she would give. My father was an honest man destroyed by powerful ones, and it is over now. And she called her mother and heard, for the first time in 20 years, something loosen in the old woman's voice. She let herself feel the size of the relief. The man at the top had confessed. The files were hers. Tomorrow she would clear her father's name in front of the whole company, and the long, cold project of her life would, at last, be finished. She slept 4 hours, the deepest she'd slept since she was a girl. She woke at 5 and read the termination order one more time, the way her father had taught her, slowly, twice, looking for the seams, and the relief drained out of her like water through a cracked floor. The order that had ended Daniel Brooks's life carried an authorizing signature in the lower corner. She had assumed, for 20 years, that it was Charles's. It was not. It was initialed. Then the whole page had been retyped and the corner deliberately clipped, so that the hand that signed her father's ruin was reduced to a torn edge and a ghost. Routed through the office of the general counsel, the routing stamp said, 2 decades ago. A dozen people had passed through that office since. So it had never been Charles. It was over, and then in a single torn corner it was not over at all, and the question that came up through Ava's chest in the gray dawn light was colder than grief. If she had spent 20 years hating the wrong man, then who, exactly, had she just handed a full night's warning? By 8 o'clock she had her answer, and it did not come the way she expected. It came in the form of an injunction. Ava arrived to find the executive floor cold and quiet, and the conference room locked. Richard Ellison was waiting in the corridor with 2 attorneys she didn't recognize and a tablet he held out to her like a verdict. The board has petitioned the court, he said pleasantly, to suspend your voting authority pending a review of the materials you've been circulating. Materials, he added, that appear to have been obtained from a deceased employee's personal effects, without authorization, and possibly removed from a secured premises. He let that sit. There's also a question, Ms. Brooks, about the provenance of the financing behind your acquisition. Until it's resolved, you can hold your shares. You simply can't vote them. The hallway seemed to tilt. 20 years of work, 51% of a company, and in a single morning it had all gone inert in her hands. A key that no longer turned anything. Worse, the story had already flipped. By noon the Chirins no longer said *hostile takeover. They said *vengeful daughter destabilizes firm with stolen documents. Her father's evidence had become her crime. The grief that was supposed to be her weapon had been turned, neatly, into her motive. "You prepared all of this," Ava said slowly, staring at the man. The filing was 40 pages long. The forensic narrative was airtight. The press framing was already running. "You couldn't have built this overnight." Ellison's expression didn't change. "We're a careful institution, Ms. Brooks." But Ava was no longer listening to his words. She was doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was terrifying. An injunction this complete, citing the locker, the financing, her father's effects, by name, could not have been assembled in the 12 hours since she'd opened a basement cabinet nobody was supposed to remember. It had been written before she found the memo. Drafted, reviewed, ready, sitting in a drawer waiting for the moment she'd reach for the one thing he'd left there for her to find. Which meant the chief legal officer of Whitmore Global hadn't been caught off guard by her arrival at all. He had been expecting her, not for a day, not for a week, but, like Charles, for years. And as the elevator doors closed Ellison out of view and left Ava alone with a worthless majority stake and a ruined name, only one question filled the silence, and it changed the shape of everything she thought she knew. How do you ambush a man who has already read the entire script, and who wrote your part in it before you ever learned your father's name? She did not go up. She went down, and she went fast, because the injunction had a second blade she hadn't seen at first. Her building access would be revoked at end of day, and security had already been handed her photograph. She had perhaps 6 hours left inside the only place the truth was buried before she'd need a court order to walk through the front doors of the company she owned. The freight elevator at the back of the building still smelled of bleach and machine oil, and it stopped, with the same arthritic shutter, 3 floors below the lobby, the sub-basement nobody upstairs could have located on a map. She rode it down past the level of marble and glass, past the level of money, into the level that kept all of it standing. Marcus Webb was 68 and had pushed a cart through these corridors for 31 years, and when he saw her his face opened with joy, and then, almost at once, closed with fear. "Little Ava?" Then, lower, glancing down the corridor. "You shouldn't be down here. They sent a memo this morning. Anybody talks to you, anybody helps you." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. She understood that the old man in front of her was risking the pension he had 3 years left to earn simply by standing in the same hallway as her, and that whoever had drafted that memo had known exactly which people to frighten. And then he set the mop against the wall and opened his arms anyway, and Ava, 51% owner of Whitmore Global Capital, the woman the whole city was watching, let an old janitor hold her in a basement that smelled like her father, while the clock ran and the memo did its quiet work 3 floors above them. "They froze me out," she said, when she could. Marcus nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting decades to be asked the right question by the right person. "You want to know about your daddy," he said. "You talked to Eddie Vargas. Night security, back then. He logged your father in and out every shift for 9 years. He lowered his voice further. And the week before they fired Daniel, somebody upstairs made Eddie change the logs. Made him erase nights your father worked. So later it'd look like Daniel was in places he had no business being." Ava went very still. "Who made him?" Eddie wouldn't say. Said it'd cost him his pension. Marcus's eyes held hers. "But here's the thing been sitting on my chest 20 years, baby. Your daddy wasn't the first." He wheeled the cart closer, like the words were heavy and he needed to set them down. "There was a man at the brokerage Whitmore bought in '99. Maintenance, like Daniel. Took the fall for a books problem, lost everything, gone within the year. Same story, same shape. His jaw worked. We used to say this building eats its quiet men. Same story, same shape." Ava felt the floor of her assumptions drop out from under her, because a single-frame janitor was a tragedy, but a pattern was a machine, something built, oiled, used again and again by someone who knew exactly how to feed it. And if the thing that had destroyed her father wasn't a crime but a method, then somewhere out there in the towers of this city, behind other marble lobbies and other engraved names, how many other quiet men had this machine already swallowed? And how many families were still, this morning, carrying a shame that had been assigned to them on purpose? She found the answer to a different question first, and it was worse than the one she'd asked. Eddie Vargas was retired, gray, and afraid, but he was also dying. Emphysema, he told her flatly, in the kitchen of a walk-up in the Bronx, and a dying man, it turned out, had a different relationship with his pension. He gave her the original logs. He'd kept photocopies for 20 years, the way frightened people keep the one thing that might one day prove they aren't crazy. And the logs led Ava back to the accordion file from locker B14, and the file led her, at 2 in the morning at her own kitchen table, into the offshore structure itself. She had a forensic accountant's training and a daughter's patience, and she read those documents the way her father had taught her to read anything important, slowly, twice, looking for the seams. The Cayman partnerships, the shell layers, the wire architecture that moved executive money out and pension money sideways and left, at every junction, a clean deniable gap where a name should have been. It was beautiful work. That was what stopped her. It was elegant, and it was old, older than the quarter that had collapsed, older than Charles's signatures, which ran through the file always as a signer, never as an asterisk author. Asterisk, someone had drafted what Charles had merely signed. She pulled the foundation memo, the document every later transfer descended from, dated 22 years ago, and she found the same wound she'd found on her father's termination order. The drafting initials in the corner had been overtyped and the corner trimmed, the author reduced to a smear of toner. Asterisk, office of the general counsel. Asterisk, no name. Laundered, deliberately, by a hand that had known one day someone might read this far back. But there was a second thing, and the second thing made her cold. The smear on the 22-year-old foundation memo, the slant of it, the trimming, the exact way the corner had been clipped, matched the smear on the compliance memo from locker B14, the one dated 4 months after her father was already in the ground. The same hand had drafted both, which meant the architect was not a ghost from the past. The man who built the machine that ate Daniel Brooks was still walking the marble halls upstairs, today, still careful enough to clip his own corners, and still, somehow, slipping documents into a dead janitor's locker 2 decades on. So the question was no longer asterisk, who destroyed my father? Asterisk, it was, who, in this building, would hand the company to the one person sworn to dig, unless burying her was the very last thing on his mind? The board's resistance broke the next morning, and it broke too easily. That was the first thing Ava should have heard. The sound of a door she'd been throwing herself against suddenly swinging open under its own weight. The injunction was set aside pending review. The board, Ellison's office announced, welcomed an independent forensic audit of the archived Brooks materials in the interest of transparency. By 10 a.m., the auditors had a finding. By 11 it had leaked. By 11:30, it was everywhere. Asterisk, Daniel Brooks did not steal from Whitmore Global. Daniel Brooks discovered financial misconduct and documented it before his termination. Executive leadership knowingly concealed the evidence to protect investor confidence. Asterisk, vindication. After 20 years. In black and white, on every screen in the country. So Ava did the thing she had dreamed of doing since she was 14 years old at a kitchen counter in Queens. At noon, every monitor in the tower switched at once, and she stood at a plain podium before the tall auditorium windows, and she told 1,000 employees and 10,000 more watching from cafeterias and security desks and loading docks that her father had been an honest man destroyed by powerful ones, and that it was over now, that the truth was finally out. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then, at the back of the room, an old janitor in a faded blue uniform began to clap. Marcus, his eyes wet under the fluorescence, and the room rose, and the sound came up like surf, deep and slow and full of recognition, and Ava stood in it and let it wash over her and thought, asterisk, I did it. Daddy, I did it. Asterisk, she believed that for almost 4 hours. The unraveling began with a young woman who would not meet her eyes in the elevator and then, at the parking level, did. Dana Okafor was a junior compliance attorney, 2 years out of law school, and her hands were shaking around her access badge. Ms. Brooks, she said. The auditors. The forensic firm. She swallowed. They were engaged by the office of the general counsel. By Mr. Ellison. 3 weeks ago. She pressed a folded page into Ava's hand. I'm probably fired for this. But somebody had to tell you that the report you just read to the whole company. Ellison's office wrote the scope of it. Ava unfolded the page in the cold of the parking garage. The audit's terms of reference. And there it was, the scope, drawn with a surgeon's care. It examined Daniel Brooks. It examined the asterisk concealment. It named executive leadership as a faceless collective and let the public mind fill that phrase with the face of the man at the top, Charles. But it did not examine the offshore structure's authorship. It did not examine the pattern, the man at the 99 brokerage, the recurring name of Blackstone Ridge. It cleared her father by burning Charles, and it walled off, beautiful and clean and complete, the only thing that truly mattered: who had built the structure in the first place. She had stood at a podium and told the truth. And the truth had been pre-cut to her measurements, handed to her gift-wrapped, and she had broadcast it to 10,000 people with tears in her eyes, sealing forever, with her own grief as the wax, exactly the version of events someone needed the world to believe. The same someone whose office had quietly drawn the scope. The same someone who had been one step ahead of her since the night she walked in. Wait. Ava leaned against a concrete pillar and made herself breathe. The ovation. The auditors. The door that opened too easily. What if the thing she had wanted most in the world, to stand up and tell the truth about Daniel Brooks, was the one move the mastermind had been counting on her to make all along? She found Ellison at dusk, alone, the city going gold then gray behind him. She put the audit's terms of reference on his desk and waited. He didn't pretend, exactly. He simply glanced at the page and then at her with something close to appetite. "Your father took 8 months to see the shape of it," he said. "You took 4 days. I'll admit that's the part one underestimated. The toner smear, the clipped corners, the hand in the locker. It was you," Ava said. "All of it. The structure, the framing, the memo you slid behind a dead man's name." Ellison neither confirmed nor denied. He picked up a pen, set it down, the only tell he gave her all night. "I'll tell you what I'm willing to tell you," he said. "I needed Charles gone. Disgraced, not retired. A confession the world would believe, delivered by someone the world couldn't doubt." He let his eyes rest on her. "You were perfect for that. Your grief did in one afternoon what I couldn't have done in 10 years. You installed me to destroy Charles." "I installed you," he agreed, "for several reasons. You've only found one of them." He smiled, and the smile did not reach anything. "Your mother seemed well, by the way. Frail. A woman that age really shouldn't be alone in a building with no security, with all this press. We worry." The threat landed soft as a card slid under a door, and Ava's blood went to ice. She had come expecting a confession that ended her questions. Instead, he had given her one answer and shown her the edge of 3 more. And as she walked out, she understood the thing that frightened her most. A man this careful had buried her father precisely because a body is load-bearing. He did not keep loose threads alive. So why, of every instrument on earth, had he chosen the one that would never stop pulling? And what did Richard Ellison still need from Ava Brooks that he had not yet taken? The move came the next morning, and it did not come as a threat. It came as a kindness. A petition had been filed, quietly, in a court in Queens, by a corporate welfare consultancy retained out of concern for Mrs. Della Brooks's well-being during a period of intense and dangerous media attention. By noon, Ava's mother had been relocated, for her own protection, to a managed facility upstate whose visitor policy was, the polite voice on the phone explained, temporarily restricted while the press situation stabilized. No crime. No ransom note. Just a frightened old woman moved beyond her daughter's reach by men who smiled while they did it. Exactly as Charles had warned. And the file the SEC was working from was still Ellison's curated audit, the one that pointed at Charles and built a clean white wall around the structure. The press had already turned. Not hostile takeover now, but was her acquisition even legitimate? He held the regulator's frame, the financing question that could void her ownership, and now, by paperwork, her mother. He could make her a hero or a felon with one filing. He had taken the one person she could not afford to lose with another. Every weapon in the building was his, including the truth, which he had already spent on her. So how do you bring down the man who owns the truth itself, when every road to him runs through your mother's locked door? She did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table until the rain thinned to nothing and the sky over Queens went the color of dishwater, and she did what her father had taught her, which was to stop looking at the thing she wanted and start looking at the thing that was true. By dawn she had it, and for one bright hour she believed she had won. Dana Okafor came to the apartment, fired, as predicted, and freer for it. and the two of them built the case across the kitchen table where Ava had once done algebra. The laundering fingerprint, the clipped corner, the overtyped initial, the same fastidious erasure repeated across 22 years of documents by a man who had never once expected anyone to read this far back. The man at the 99 brokerage, whose ruin matched Daniel's down to the grammar of the press release. And threaded through all of it, surfacing and submerging, the same patient entity, Blackstone Ridge. He had not just framed her father. He had built a recurring machine and concealed his ownership of it behind a holding company that had never, in 2 decades, once been named in a single filing, until that night, when Dana traced the proxy chain to its end and found Richard Ellison's name sitting quietly at the bottom of it. "This is him," Dana whispered, her finger on the page. "This is the whole thing. This buries him." And then Ava saw the seam, and the bottom dropped out of the morning. "No," she said slowly. "It doesn't." She pulled the acquisition file, her own file, the one she'd been so proud of, and laid it beside the structuring memos, and there it was, the thing she'd refused to see for 4 years because she had needed so badly not to. The financing that had bought her 51%. The seller of record. The same patient entity. "If I prove Ellison controls Blackstone Ridge," she said, and her voice had gone very quiet, "I prove Blackstone Ridge sold me this company. And the second I do that, every regulator in the country has to ask the question Ellison wrote the script for. They have to ask whether my acquisition was real, or whether I'm just the latest part the machine cast." Dana stared at her. "You'd be voiding your own ownership. I'd be handing it back to the board he controls. The pension restoration evaporates. The health coverage evaporates. Every promise I made to those people in that auditorium dies the instant I file." Ava pressed her fingers to her eyes. Charles's voice came back to her, from a darkened boardroom. Take the company and run it clean and let the rest of it stay buried. He hadn't been protecting himself. He'd been telling her the only way out that didn't cost her everything. He built it so the truth destroys me. I can clear my father's name, or I can keep the power to do something with it. I cannot do both. The evidence was complete, and it was a noose. She had spent 20 years and her whole self to reach this table, and she sat at it now holding the one weapon in the world that would, the moment she fired it, turn around and finish the job the machine had started on her family. Was there any version of the truth, any path she had not yet found, that did not require her to lose the exact thing her father had died believing in? She found it the way she found everything that mattered, by remembering. The financial files were poisoned. The locker was poisoned. He had known about it, used it, salted it with a memo from after the grave. Every channel the system kept records on, Ellison owned, because the system was the thing he had built. But her father had known that. The logs were altered the week before the firing. Daniel had seen it coming. A man with no patron, who could trust no lawyer and no locker, would hide the truth where the system kept no records, and give it to the one person no one with power ever bothers to watch. A child. She had until 5 o'clock. Ellison had moved to revoke her access a second time, and after 5 her badge would die and the loading docks would belong to him, and somewhere upstate a phone line to her mother stayed restricted while the clock ran. She drove to the building before the cameras woke and went down to loading dock 3, and there they stood, 3 machines older than the company's logo. Machine 3's got the good stuff, 20 years away, and it's got a blind spot. She knelt into the 1 square foot of the whole glass tower that no lens had ever covered and no record had ever logged. The corner her father had mapped for her when she was 8 and called ours, and her fingers closed on a brittle plastic bag. Inside it, a small cassette and a single sheet of paper folded into a hard square. She did not open the paper there. She sat on the cold concrete with her back against machine 3, exactly where she had sat at 8 years old, and she pressed the cassette into the old player she had carried in her bag for 2 days for no reason she could have named, and she put in the earbuds, and she pressed play, and her father's voice, tired, warm, a little hoarse, humming the first bar of Fly Me to the Moon before he caught himself, filled her head after 20 years of silence. If you're hearing this, baby girl, then you got smart, and you got strong, and you came looking, and I'm sorry it had to be you. There's a lawyer named Richard Ellison, junior man. He called me up to the 44th floor last Tuesday and asked me to sign some papers, and I read them first, which they never expect us to do. He built something crooked and they need a name to hang it on, and I'm the name. I'm not going to fight it loud, because if I fight it loud, they'll come for your mother and they'll come for you, and you're worth more than my pride. So I'm going to take it quiet. But I wrote it all down, and I said his name out loud right here, so that one day, when you're bigger than they are, you can do what I couldn't. Ava sat in the diesel dark and wept the way she had not let herself weep in 20 years. Not for the loss anymore, but because he had known, and he had chosen them over his own name, and he had trusted her to be the kind of woman who would one day come back and kneel behind a vending machine and finish it. The system had guarded every door in the building. But who, in all of Richard Ellison's careful architecture, had ever thought to guard a father's last gift to his daughter? She had a dead man's voice, named and dated, that belonged to no chain Ellison controlled. She thought that made it untouchable. By the time she reached the lobby, Ellison had already shown her how wrong she was. His statement was out within the hour. The so-called recording was an obvious fabrication, conveniently discovered by a vengeful daughter with no witnesses, no chain of custody, no provenance. The desperate forgery of a woman whose own acquisition was under federal question. The very thing that had made the tape clean, that it had come to her through nothing but love and a hidden corner, was the thing he used to call it a lie. And it worked. By afternoon, 2 networks were calling it unverified. One called it *manufactured. Daniel's voice, after 20 years, was being drowned a second time, which left exactly one person on Earth who could authenticate it. The last living man who had heard Daniel Brooks sing in these halls. The last man who knew Ellison had drafted the structure. And Ava was no longer sure he would speak. When she found Charles in the basement records room and played the tape into the dust-smelling dark, he closed his eyes, and he did not say yes. Ellison came to me last night, Charles said quietly. A soft landing, quiet retirement, full pension, the company's lawyers between me and any charge. If I stay silent and let the audit stand. His hands trembled. If I corroborate this instead, I implicate myself in all of it. Fraud. Concealment. I will not retire gracefully. I will be charged. I will die with this as my name. He looked at the small machine, at the bar of Sinatra still hanging in the air, and for a long, unbearable moment Ava could not tell which man she was standing in front of, the one who had warned her, or the one who had been warning himself. Then Charles reached into his coat and took out a folded page, soft with age, a resignation letter, signed in his own hand the week her father was fired, never submitted. I almost walked away the night they chose him, he said. I told myself I could fix it from the inside. I never fixed anything. He drew a breath that shook the whole length of him. Get me a phone and a lawyer who has never worked for Richard Ellison. I'll say all of it. On the record. Today. The visible villain chose, at the last possible moment and against his own survival, to become the witness. And the only question left was whether 2 voices, one of them dead and one of them ruined, could break a wall the world had already decided to believe. Justice came, and it came the way it actually comes, late, partial, and only after the man fought. Ellison did not go quietly. He had branded the tape a forgery, moved Della beyond reach, turned the press. He made them earn every inch. But Charles's corroboration authenticated a dead man's voice the forensic labs could no longer dismiss. And once the wall cracked, the structure behind it could be seen by daylight. The original framing of Daniel Brooks lay too far in the past for most of it to be charged. The law has a short memory for what it does to quiet men. But the offshore structure was current. The injunction built on planted materials was obstruction. The concealed ownership of Blackstone Ridge was fraud. He was charged on what could be charged. He was disbarred. It was not enough, and it would never be enough, and it was nonetheless true and on the record for every other tower in the city to read. The welfare petition collapsed the day the charges landed. The polite men with their facility and their restricted visitor policy evaporated the way such men always do when the paperwork stops protecting them, and Della Brooks came home to the apartment in Queens with the cracked linoleum, smaller and more frightened than before, and alive. One thing the inquiry could not touch. A federal examiner reopened the question of how a healthy man had died 3 weeks after his firing, with a certificate signed by the company's own physician and not a single question asked. There was nothing left to find. No proof, no body, only a clipped corner of a record 20 years cold. The file was closed unresolved, which was its own verdict. The deepest harm the machine had done was the one harm it could never be made to answer for. And Ava did the hard thing. The thing Charles had warned her against. The thing her father's tape had finally freed her to do. She gave up the chair. Because the only way to make her father's vindication clean, to keep it from being just one more move inside Ellison's machine, was to refuse the power the machine had handed her. She placed her controlling stake in an independent trust, governed by people with no thread connecting them to Blackstone Ridge, and she made the trust's first binding act the thing she had only been able to promise from a podium: full pension restoration for every custodial and maintenance worker the company had ever cut, equal health coverage across every tier, and a permanent, externally audited record clearing the name of Daniel Brooks. Not a curated audit this time. The real one. The whole shape of it. She walked away from 51% of Whitmore Global Capital so that the truth she'd fought for would belong to no one, least of all to her. If justice arriving 20 years late, incomplete, with the worst crime unpunishable and the price paid mostly by a man already in the ground. If that was justice at all, then maybe justice was never the courtroom kind. Maybe it was only ever this: a name, finally spoken correctly, out loud, where everyone could hear it. 3 months later, the lobby of Whitmore Global looked almost the same, but the light came through warmer, and the people moved through it with their heads up. A plaque had gone in beside the elevators, simple engraved metal that caught the morning sun. Asterisk Daniel Brooks. In honor of integrity, dignity, and the unseen hands that carry every institution forward. Asterisk Marcus Webb touched it every morning on his way in. Most people did. Ava stood near it with her hands folded, watching the building wake. No executive door behind her now, and no title in front of her name. She preferred it. Her parents had always started work before sunrise. Charles found her there. He was thinner, older, awaiting a trial he had insisted on rather than fled, and somehow lighter for it than she had ever seen him. He carried a small cardboard box. Inside were photographs, a faded thermos, and a portable radio with worn headphones wrapped around it, the things from storage that no one had thought to throw away. "There's a tape still in it," Charles said quietly. "I didn't listen." Ava lifted the radio with both hands. Her thumb found the worn plastic, the scratches she remembered from late-night bus rides through Queens with her head on her father's shoulder. She did not need to play it now. She knew it would not be evidence this time, would not name anyone, would not bring anything down. It would just be a tired man humming Nat King Cole on a night shift, badly, happily, alive, the part of him the machine had never been able to touch because it had never thought such a thing was worth taking. "He embarrassed me once," Charles said, looking at the plaque. Walked into a room full of investors with a vacuum cleaner and sang at full volume because he thought it was empty. Everyone laughed. He paused. "One of them told me afterward your father was the happiest man he'd ever seen in this building." Charles rested one hand briefly against the cool metal of the name. He was right about the thing he used to say. The people nobody notices are usually the ones holding everything together. Then he walked out into the winter light, toward whatever was coming for him, and Ava stood alone beside her father's name with his radio warm in her hands, listening to the ordinary morning sounds of a building that had finally learned to look down. She thought about the trust and the cleared record and the pension checks that were already going out. She thought about how little of it felt like winning and how much of it felt, instead, like a debt acknowledged at last. And she thought about all the other towers. There were so many of them, a whole bright skyline of them stretching north toward the park, each one full of marble and glass and money, each one held up, floor by quiet floor, by people no one in the boardrooms upstairs had ever once bothered to see. Her father's name was clean now, but somewhere in every one of those buildings, this morning, a quiet man was mopping a floor or logging a shift or saving a child a piece of candy from Machine 3, holding the whole thing up, unnoticed, unthanked. Ava did not win by taking the building. She won by making the building remember who had been holding it up all along, and who was coming, in 20 years, to kneel in the dark behind their machines and finish what they had been too unseen to finish themselves.